What's happening? What's happening, and how are you doing today, blues people? As you know, every show is a special show, and this one is even more special than the last. Today, we're celebrating Michael L. Jones as August African American Folklorist of the Month on Jug Band's Journalism and Louisville Soundscape. We're also celebrating him as a musicologist, ethnomusicologist, historian, and folklorist because he kind of, I don't say dances in between all of these things, but similar to W.E.B. Du Bois, employs all of these things to raise the awareness of African American traditions in Louisville and abroad. Mr. Jones is a distinguished journalist, author, music historian, and cultural preservationist based in Louisville, Kentucky. Again, a folklorist who is not only documenting but actively lives within the cultural legacies he explores. He straddles the folklorist and ethnomusicology line with grace and clarity, and his contributions to preserving Louisville's Black and working class histories through music, journalism, and public humanities work have been nothing short of vital. He is the author of Louisville Jug Music From Earl McDonald to the National Jubilee, a landmark book that traces the story of jug band music, a folk form born on the banks of the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, from its early roots through its evolution into a national treasure. The book earned the 2015 Samuel Thomas Book Award for Best Local History from Louisville Historical League. Michael's dedication to cultural storytelling extends far beyond the page, folks. He has served as a staff writer for the Louisville Defender, LEO Weekly, Jeffersonville Evening News, and has contributed to respected outlets including Louisville Magazine, Oxford American, and the Unti Reader. Currently, he is the economic development reporter for Louisville's Business First and co-founder and editor of Black Scene Millennium, a digital revival of the iconic Black Scene publication from the 1970s. Oh, there's more. We're not playing around here. His public-facing folk life work includes co-curating the acclaimed Celebrating the Sounds of Kentucky exhibition at the Fraser History Museum in 2019 and serving on the boards of the Louisville Historical League, Portland Museum, and the National Jug Band Jubilee, a nationally renowned festival dedicated to the preservation and celebration of Louisville's role in the development of jug band music. And there's other things that he's doing currently that we're about to get to. As the August honoree of the African American Folklorist of the Month series, we recognize Michael not only for his archival and historical contributions, but for his role in activating Black folk traditions, making them visible, audible, and accessible through writing, performance, festival organizations, curations, and mentorship. Not to mention, he is a feature writer for the African American Folklorist. If I keep going, we don't need to even do the interview. I can just do an entire piece on this good brother. Let's bring him to the stage. What's happening, sir?
That's a lot, man. I was like, man, who is that?
You've done a lot, bro. You've been doing some work.
Yeah, I always like to say I'm a music nerd. That's how I got started. So, just discovering one thing, one band leads to another band, and you just get into it.
So let's start there. One band leads to another band. How did you get? What becoming a someone who's all these titles? Yeah, but you document music history. Yeah. How did you get there?
Well, I went to a high school that they called it a magnet school. And so it was Manual High School. but there were people there, like I was specialized in communications. What you would have like a major, you know, and so I was in the communications program, but we also had a performing arts program, and my best friend was a guitarist, and we worked. His name was Tony, and we worked at a restaurant together, and we would hang out and listen to music all the time. And so I would hang out with these musicians and, like, you know, kind of learn how to listen to music. And then my I was raised by my grandparents, and they only liked old music. You know, they're a suspect of anything made after 1970. So there's a lot of Mahalia Jackson, Miles Davis, and stuff like that. And I really didn't like that kind of music, the older black music. You know, when I was growing up, I was more into like punk rock and hip hop. But then after my grandmother died, I went through this period where I was listening to a lot of the music that I knew she liked, you know. And so I was listening to a lot of blues music. And then someone left a copy of Robert Johnson's the King of the Delta Blues had just come out, and it was a big box set. And he left it in my house, and I called him and to give it back to him, and he said he'd like it and I should keep it. So I kept started listening to a CD, reading everything about Robert Johnson, you know, reading the Robert Palmers and Paul Olivers. And a book that really was important to me was Blues People by Leroy Jones.
Yep.
And the thing that I got from that is he said that the blues marked the moment when the descendants of slaves started become African American. You know, when they were singing songs about home, they weren't singing about Nigeria or Senegal. They were just singing about Georgia and Alabama. But there was like this part where he talked about music earlier than the blues, but he never got into it. Like, you know, like that's something between the folk field, you know, the African work songs and things that were happening, and that, you know, and so I always wondered what that was, you know. And then one day I was going in a record store called Underground Sounds, and I was going through some import CDs, and I came across one from RST. It was a label from Austria, and was Clifford Hayes and the Jug Band of Louisville. And you know, and I looked at it, and all the musicians were black. And I'd always thought of jug bands as this white mountain music, you know, the Darlings, Andy Griffith, Emmett and Otter's Jug Band, Christmas. That's the only imagery that I had gotten from it. And so I bought the CD, and it happened to be written by this woman, Brenda Bogart, the liner notes. It was written by someone who lived in my neighborhood.
Oh, wow.
And her husband, Penn, was a historian at the Filson, where I'm now on the board. And so I went and talked to him, and that was my introduction to the history of jug bands. And what Penn had said, and Penn introduced me to the Juggernaut Jug Band. And this was a white jug band, and they had become interested in the genre from like the 60s folk revival, the Dave Von Ronks and Jim Kweskin. And then they found out later that Louisville had this history of black jug bands. So I wrote this article. I was at the time I was working for Leo newspaper. It's Louisville Eccentric Observer. And I was writing about music, and I was writing about, at the time, Louisville had a big indie rock scene. And so it was like a lot of like Slint, math rock and stuff. And
Right.
so I was living, my friend Tony from high school had he had a band, he had quit school, and he had a band, and were putting a record out, and they were touring. And I had quit school. I had dropped out of school. I was studying journalism, and I moved back to Louisville, and I moved in with the band.
Oh my goodness.
So it became our house. They called it Rabbit Manor because that was the name of my friend's band. And like they had a rehearsal space there, and other bands rehearsed there. So you know, I was really into this. Like I was being a journalist because I had started writing freelancing for Leo, and then I became a staff writer there. And so
Haha.
doing this, like covering politics, but then I was also hanging out with all these musicians in my off time, and our house was like this hub. So I'd written this article, so I felt like I had this skill set to understand what jug band, the significance of it, because it reminded me of the blues music, you know, that my grandparents listened to. And I was writing about music because I was writing about all these bands. So I wrote this article. It was called "That Crazy Jug Band Sound."
Mm.
And it was just on everything I could dig up. There was a lawyer named Fred Cox who had started to write a jug band book, and his material was published by Storyville, which was a magazine, blues magazine in England.
Hmm.
And one of my friends, this guy Todd Brashear, he was in a band called Slint that was really popular in Europe. So he actually went to Europe and got me all the copies of this
Wow.
blues magazine with the jug band stuff in it. And you know, it was like weird how all parts of my life were working for this, because you know, so he brought that back. So I write this story, and then I get contacted. Well, first I put together a compilation. My Leo, I left there because the founder sold it so he could run for Congress, and he was our congressman for a long time, John Yarmouth. And so I told John we need to preserve all these old articles. And he's like, I'm not going to pay for that, but if you want to preserve yours, that's great. So he gave me permission to use whatever I wanted. So I put together this compilation of my articles from Leo, and I realized the only people buying my book wanted this one jug band story. It's just like,
Wow.
I would get like emails, because then the internet was starting to become a thing. So the story I was getting like questions from people from out of state, even out of the country. And if I would do research and try and find out if I could answer it. And so I did pretty well with that book. I self-financed, self-published, made all my money back.
Wow.
And then the jug band, the jug band Jubilee had started already, and Rod Wentz, the founder of it, had invited me to sell books there, and eventually I would give talks and join the board. But it was like still shooting fish in the barrel, you know, jug band festival and history of jug bands. So, you know, I did really well with that. And my wife, when I was working on the book, she was like, you know, when are you going to write about something people are interested in? But then after it came out and, you know, was winning awards and stuff, she was like, you know, who knew the world wanted a book about jug bands, you know? But, you know, there was like Louisville, people don't think about Louisville as a big music town, but it's a something where like it's a strange town like you wouldn't think of Dayton, Ohio as like the funk capital of the world, you know?
Right, right, right,
You
right.
know, but Louisville, the things we're known for are like, you know, jug bands. Yes, we produced some of the first jug bands to record in, you know, the bourbon industry and Carrick's that been in town. And then we have this math rock, this weird 90s indie rock thing that those people are famous around the world.
Yeah,
So,
and you also have Sylvester Weaver, right, and Sarah
yeah.
Martin.
Yeah, and see, Sir Martin, you know, the thing about Louisville, you know, we're a river town. And so I always say in my talk that the river was the information superhighway of the 19th century.
Mhm.
So everybody, you know, we have these narratives about how American popular music evolved. And you know, the blues started in Mississippi, the jazz started in New Orleans. But the thing is, you had black musicians working on the river, either playing music or like working as labor, and they're going back and forth to New Orleans from Louisville, from Cincinnati, St. Louis, and you know, those are all big music towns. And so we in Louisville, we got string bands and brass bands at the same time as New Orleans. And in the 1890s, there was this weird fad in New Orleans. They were called spasm bands. And they were kids groups that were playing on homemade instruments, be like a cigar box bass or something like that, you know, worst tub. And so Jelly Roll Martin in the Alan Lomax interview that he did for Library of Congress, he says the spasm bands were worst bands he ever heard. And, you know, they're playing in Storyville, these little kids bands.
Right, right.
And so, but that comes to Louisville along the river, you know, and jug blowing is something that it did not originate in Louisville. And you know, the most popular jug band is the Memphis Jug Band. You know, jug blowing was just a southern thing, and in my book I trace its roots back to Nigeria.
Really?
You know, and yeah, because it's always with the banjo. And so in some of the rites in West Africa, they would put things like horns and different things like voice disguisers in to change their voice, because if you're messing around with spirits, you don't want them to be able to follow you back home.
Right.
And those skills, those things that you know, they persisted when people were enslaved, but they lost their ritual meaning, you know, and so they became things like kazoos and,
Right.
you know, rattles or whatever, you know, they were doing. And who knows what was going on in the, you know, the invisible religious ceremonies, you know.
Right,
I
right,
think in
right.
Christina Gaddy's book, Well of Souls, she talks about the banjo having some religious significance, but
Right.
just like jug blowing was disconnected from African American culture, so is the banjo. You know, we're just now rediscovering that history. So, but Louisville,
Yeah.
because of where we are, you know, shipping is what we do. We're the city is located right by the Falls of the Ohio, which is like the only barrier, you know, between Pittsburgh and I think New Orleans.
Wow.
So, like, there were times where we're at the safest place to unload, and people would sometimes have to unload their one ship, travel by land when you couldn't cross, you know, the falls.
Right.
and all that, and so that once the steamboats came and you could go against the current, the trade with New Orleans created a lot of money. And
Mm,
and we got things like theaters, and we got the Derby. So
right.
musicians always say, that Louisville's a money town. So if you're like from Memphis or New Orleans, if you're a musician touring and you're making your way to Chicago or Indy or someplace like that, you're going to stop in Louisville.
Right.
And so these musicians, they were exposed to all these different styles, but made it uniquely our own. The jug is like the poor man's tuba, is what they
Hmm.
call it. It was portable, it only plays the bass notes. But once the distillery saw like these bands playing, holding jugs, like, why don't you put that old granddad on that jug? Why don't you put my salute? So that's why it persisted here, between 1890 and 1930. There were like 30 active jug bands in Louisville. And Sarah Martin, a blues singer, she recorded with the Louisville Jug Band, some members of that, and they produced the first jug band recording in 1925.
Wow.
And the second band to record was also a Louisville a band. It was Whistler's Jug Band, and they went into the studio 2 weeks after Sarah did. And so, the influence, it started a trend that inspired like the Memphis Jug Band and other jug bands and stuff. So that's why we say Louisville's the home of jug bands, because we injected it into the mainstream culture,
Right.
you
You
know.
cultivated it.
But
It
Louisville's a weird little town because they're really into arts. Um, like we are one of 13 cities with all the major arts. We get
Right.
arts organizations. We have an orchestra, opera, ballet, actors theater.
Wow.
You know,
Well,
um, so this is a town that really encourage, and even me, like I said, I grew up in West Louisville, which is a mostly African American part of town. Like I think something like 75% of Black people in Louisville live there. You know,
yeah.
yeah, and so, but I had access to arts. I went to the school where I actually studied. I took a playwriting class
Oh wow.
when I was in school. So I've always had that kind of mix of the journalism and history with kind of an artistic bent, and
Right.
music's a way to kind of combine those. Um,
Well, I'll tell you, folks. If nothing else, by this point, you should know why he is the African American folklorist of this month. You're spewing these things off, ironically, in almost a linear order. This is a masterclass. Let me ask you though, at what point? Because I really like the last statement because it's a perfect segue. At what point did you begin to realize that you were doing more than just journalism, that you were actually conducting oral history, documentation, and things of this style?
Well, when I was working on the Jug Band book, I actually tracked down family members of some of the descendants of some of these jug blowers and musicians, and a lot of them had no idea about
Wow.
any of it. Sarah Martin at one time was the highest paid Black performer in America. She was one of those classic blues singers,
Got
uh,
it. Yeah.
early on. And but at one point in the 30s, she lost her voice during the performance, and she thought that God wanted her to give up the blues. So she tried to pivot to gospel music. She even worked with Thomas Dorsey, but the gospel community never accepted her because she had been married 3 times. She was known to have, diamonds in her teeth and fine clothes. But, Thomas Dorsey can make the jump from tapping that
Right.
thing to, gospel, precious Lord. But she couldn't. So she came back to Louisville. Sarah came back to Louisville and opened a nursing home. So she had a daughter named Ola Thornton. And so this is the kind of, like I say, I'm a music nerd, the craziness you have to do sometime. So I called every Thornton in Jeffersonville. She lived across the river from me. And so I knew her husband's name was James Thornton. So I called every James Thornton, and I ended up getting a nephew. And he had known Sarah when he was a little boy. And I was telling him about her career and everything. And he said, "That's news to me. I've only ever heard her sing in church." Like,
Wow.
he just thought she ran a nursing home and
Wow.
that was it, sung at at church on Sundays. Like, she didn't talk about that.
Wow.
And
That's real folkloristic work that you're doing there, but keep going.
yeah, and so it's the same with some of that. Like, there's a Terry Gold is Earl McDonald's a granddaughter, and her mother never really talked much about Earl's music career because, like, who would think people would be interested in it. So Terry told me, like, more about him than I do.
Wow.
Like, they were able to come to the Jubilee. We had, for a while, we were having our festival. We did it for like 18 years, annual festival celebrating jug bands and bringing in people from everywhere. But COVID kind of slowed that down, and we lost a lot of volunteers and board members. But we're hoping to bring it back next year.
Well, you know what? I want to jump around a bit, particularly since you brought up the Jubilee, because you don't just engage the work through writing, but you also engage the work through public practice and public facing programming. So I mean, living in a house full of musicians, I can see how this starts. But talk to us this connection, right? And then the importance and significance of making sure the community is aware of these things that you're doing.
Yeah, well, at the same time that I was living with these musicians, I had met a guy. His name was Richard Cush Griffith. And Cush was an older black blues man. But when he was younger, he had played with James Brown and Parliament Funkadelic. He had been the music director for the Brides of Funkenstein. And he had even toured with Marvin Gaye, but he had lived that like rock and roll lifestyle, and he ended up having diabetes and he lost his sight. So he ended up in Louisville, and he was playing every weekend at this blues bar called Zena's Cafe. And so the first time I saw him, I was an intern at the Courier Journal at the newspaper in town, and I was 19, and they snuck me in to see him. And they were going to introduce me, but I was so nervous because Parliament was my favorite band. So I was like, didn't meet him at that time. But I ended up years later when I was living with my friend Tony and his band, we would go there regularly, and I got to know Kush. And so I wrote a few stories about him. He even took me to Bootsy Collins' house in
Wow.
Cincinnati
Wow.
at one time, and I met Fred Wesley there. So Kush was like, introduced me to a different level of it, of music, and kind of thinking about it as a business and everything. And then he had some medical issues, and so I put together a benefit for him. So that's the first show that I'd put together. And Melvin, oh god, oh no, Maceo Parker. No, Maceo Parker and his brother Melvin. They came and performed with my roommates.
Oh, wow.
My friend Tony's
Yeah.
band
Yeah.
backed them up, and there's a video of it on YouTube. They were called the Leisure Thieves. And so Kush had played with Maceo and all the King's Men, and he had written a song called Southwick
Mm.
that was one of their songs. And so they played there. We did the video of him playing it. He was in a wheelchair, and he ended up dying 2 weeks after this benefit for him. So
Mm.
but so that was the first event that I'd put on. And then I joined the board of this arts organization that was called Arts Watch. And it was kind of like an indie thing. And, we had this space and we put on art shows and music. And like I said, Louisville is just like a real artistic place. If you say you're a writer, everybody treats you like a writer. If you say you're, or at that time, it
Right.
might, this was like a short time in the 90s when I came up, But even before I written anything, I would talk about writing stuff, and people were like, "Oh, Michael's a writer."
I mean, but that's good. That sounds like great communal support and encouragement.
Yeah. And so I was able to, bring different elements of the community together, like the indie rock scene and the blues scene, and become kind of like a connector. And then at the same time, I'm writing, in the publications. And so people know who I am
Right. Right.
on that. So.
And so that led to, and this is a question more than a statement. So I guess I should reframe it. So would you say this led to all your amazing curations of the different programs? I mean, even the one with, I believe Dom Fleming's about author of
Oh,
Schultz.
yeah, Arnold Schultz stuff.
Yes, Arnold Schultz. I should know
Yeah.
his name like the back of my hand.
Yeah. Yeah, it was just like knowing people. That was during COVID. The Louisville Folk School wanted to put on these webinars, and so they had wanted me basically to host them. And so everybody in Louisville like kind of like knows each other. It's like my friend calls it Big Town Mayberry. So Dave Howard from Louisville Folk School approached me about doing this. And the first one he wanted to do was this lady Rachel Grimes was a descendant of some of the first families to come into Kentucky, pioneer families.
Okay.
And she found out that her family owned the first slave
Mm.
in Kentucky, basically in Boonesboro,
Mm-hmm,
and
mm-hmm.
Daniel Boone, like this woman, Dolly. And so she had been doing all this history around it and tracing Dolly's ancestors and doing all that. And Rachel was a musician. And so Dave wanted to uh, have her be the first one, the first a person for me to host this thing. But what he didn't know is that one of Dolly's descendants was a minstrel composer named Henry Hart, who had lived in Evansville, Indiana, near Louisville. And so, because it involved that minstrel setting, Rachel had come to me for help, and I had been helping her on this project. So the project that Dave was like pitching to me was actually my own project that I had been involved in, you know. And so we did that, and then they had talked to Dom about doing the Arnold Schultz thing because the Bluegrass Foundation was giving out like a scholarship or something.
Yes.
They were doing something, and I had known Dom because I'd met him because I'd interviewed him for my Jug Band book.
Right.
And so and then Leela McCullough from the Chocolate Drops,
Yep.
she and I did something about Haiti and its connection to the banjo, and so I had met her in passing, but when the Chocolate Drops had done shows here, but that's really when I met her.
I mean that's super duper groovy. Because there was a couple of things I know you were telling me about different families that you were working with, because there was different parts of this story that was connected to the I guess Black history of Kentucky.
Mm-hmm.
Do you care to go into any of them? Even with the one of the stories you were working on that had to do with one of the regiments that became an all-Black camp that you spoke about in the early days of the documentations of Black spirituals, even though it was after Fort and Grimke.
Oh, I know what you're talking about. Well, one thing that I've become interested in is the contraband camps,
Yes.
and that the fugitive slaves during the Civil War, the Union considered them contraband, and I had been looking into. Basically, I said West Louisville is where Black people always have lived in Louisville, as long as I've been around, and it's also the place where there was a contraband camp, and the first schools and stuff were, so I was like, during the Civil War, Kentucky didn't leave the Union. And so we were a garrison, we were like a depot for the Union Army, but we were a slave state. So there are still there are people supporting the Confederacy. There's a lot of craziness going on. And but I got interested, like, no matter what I'm you know uh start out researching, somehow it gets to music. So I was like, trying to follow where the abolitionists were going. But then, the contraband camps, they helped popularize the use of ABCs, the ABC song. because that's what they would use to teach, these,
Mm.
people who hadn't learned to read. And then the first spirituals, show up in these camps too. And they were something like, um, I can't remember all the history offhand, but
Right.
it's like there's a couple of decades in there before the Civil War where there's no spirituals, and then all of a sudden they exist, or they're popularized and kind of bubble up,
Right. Right.
And so I'm always like, just like when Leroy Jones was talking about the blues and what came before. I was like, what was that? Those ingredients that came into that?
No, I mean, that's real. I mean, you again, you bring all of these things together as a historian, folklorist, and ethnomusicologist. But there is musicologist in there, as in the history of the music as well. So, what I want to ask you is what? Why is it important? First of all, for you, before we speak about anybody else, whether it's someone who wants to do it or whatever, or some audience members who are interested in your work. Before we get to any of them, why is this stuff significant for you to bring it to the forefront?
Well, because it'll disappear. People forget about it if we don't document it now. Like my latest project, the Soulful Sounds of Derbytown, is a history of Black music in Louisville and all different genres. But most of my collaborators were in their 70s and 80s, and so that was going to be a lot of history lost. And I ended up becoming the editor of that book. And then I also contributed, to the project. And so it was great trying to weaving a whole narrative out of, even though it's split up in genres. And like each section begins with a historical essay, and then we have biographies of some important people. But when you look at it in total, and it's just like amazing. There's things like, like I said, Louisville is a weird city, and things that you don't think of would happen here happen. Like the group, do you know the doo-wop group, the Moonglows?
Tell us about
Yeah.
them.
Harvey Fuqua, you know,
Yes.
Bobby Lester. Okay, they're all from Louisville, the original group. They were a group from Louisville called the Crazy Sounds. And so Harvey's house burned down. He wanted to leave town. The band moves to Cleveland. Alan Freed, the rock around the clock DJ, it becomes their manager. His nickname's Moondog. He changes their name to the Moonglows. They have some hits, but first it was Harvey and Bobby were the leaders, but then Harvey kind of just takes over. So the rest of the people leave. He recruits some younger singers at the new Moonglows. And then one of the new Moonglows is Marvin Gaye.
Wow.
And so Harvey ends up marrying one of Berry Gordy's sisters and becoming a producer at Motown. And that's how Marvin Gaye gets to Motown.
Wow.
We're Louisville connection. And on top of that, Marvin Gaye's dad grew up in Lexington, Kentucky.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
So in the book, we have one of his cousins, Martha Gaye, who was in Louisville for a while. Yeah.
Wow. So wait, so with all this great rich information, talk to us about the construction of this book, because you have multiple, I guess, firsthand experience, firsthand narrative contributors, and then you're working with each and every one of these elders, as well as the multitude of research you were doing. What kind of undertaking was this?
I would never do it again. I just didn't know what I was getting into. So this started out as a photo exhibit.
Mm.
The guy who put the project together, his name is King Clay, and he's a big music producer here. And he every February he has an event called Celebrating the Legacy of Black Louisville. So one year he decided he wanted to celebrate Black musicians, and so he put together this group of people to collect photos, and the University of Louisville, blew them up and made them really nice, and we did a timeline around the center, and so when I had left, we had a big event. I left, and then Christy Brown of the family that owns Brown Foreman, Bourbon family, she
Yes.
saw it and she said, "This should be a book, and I'll pay for it." So we're like, okay, well, I guess we're writing the book, So we think all of us are music experts in quotation marks there. So, I've written this book about jug bands. Ken's been a jazz producer in town. He was also co-author of a history of African Americans in Louisville called 2 Centuries of Black Louisville.
Mm.
The gospel section was going to be done by Wilma Claiborne. Well, she did the gospel section, and she had the first gospel record store in town.
Oh, wow.
And was a choir director for 50 years. We had one of the founders of the Kentuckiana Blues Society doing the blues section and stuff. And so, there's 6 of us. It's too many people, especially people passionate about music.
Right,
Because
right.
you get musicians like, there's a guy named Thomas Queen who he was a piano player, grew up playing in the church, played on Sundays for different churches, but also played with the Louisville Orchestra and played jazz. So Gary Falk, who's doing the jazz section, is like, Thomas Queen's mine. He's going in my section. Will was like, oh, he came up in the church. I want him in gospel. And then, the kids doing the classical and stuff. And he's like, he played with the orchestra every Christmas. And so that's 2 years. And then
Wow.
it's just like, should this people go in the book or not? You got to get your criteria.
Right.
And then till the very end, we were discovering people.
Mm.
Because we were looking for people who, some people have just like minor connections to Louisville, like Lionel Hampton was born here and he lived here until he was like 3. And he always listed us as his hometown and came back to visit family. So we could say he's in the book.
Right.
Roland Hayes was the opera singer, was kind of discovered here. There was he was a singing waiter
Right.
at a club here, but then we have some people like nobody out of Louisville outside of the city would know,
Right. Right.
this in the woods people, but and we told people, like, we did this for 8 years. We couldn't get everybody,
Right.
But we got as many as we could. And now people, and then a lot of people, I guess they don't believe you're actually going to get it done, because it did take 8 years. And there are a lot of people that were like, is this going to happen? And that's how I ended up becoming the editor, because I had I'd self-published my first book, and I'd worked at a printing house for a couple years as an editor, doing science textbooks.
Oh,
And
wow.
so,
That's how you just snuck that in.
so, um, so our copy editor had moved to Portugal.
Mm,
And I told you all my collaborators were in their 70s and 80s. So they were not tech friendly. Let's put it
right.
that way. So I would have to communicate with the copy editor and go to each of their houses on the weekends
Mm,
and work with them to get, we print them out copies of their section.
wow.
And so that's how I ended up with, like, casually becoming the editor of it, because I had to just move people, and all these people see me as this annoying kid, and I have to give them homework and be like, I
Right.
do this. You can't just call him Bishop this,
What
Uh,
that sounds a lot like field ethnography. If
so it was like, especially Wilma, who did the gospel section. you know um I worked with her a lot, because she came in like 2 years into the project. We decided that we were going to add gospel, and so I wrote a lot. We collaborated a lot on the history, and she would want to go off on broader things, and I would have to keep it focused, because I'm like, this isn't the book. This
right.
is a section of the book that has to be like 2,000 words, because I'm
Right.
thinking like technical, and she's like, and so I remember running into her grandson. Her grandson is a singer, Jason Claiborne. He's written like hit gospel songs and stuff. And this is how everyone knows everybody in Louisville. My Jason Claiborne is the music director at my father's church, or was, but I didn't know
Wow.
this when I was working with Wilma. But my father died a couple years ago, and Jason volunteered to come in and sing for us.
Wow.
And when I saw him, I knew who he was, and I said, "Oh, I'm the one your grandmother is always complaining about." And he knew who I was. I didn't say anything else.
Well, now with all the blood, sweat, and tears, though, it was worth it, because you guys captured some very prolific, if you will, black music history and stories, right?
Well, we did more than that, because for our book launch, we put out a concert. We were like taking it from the page to the stage. So we had a show at the Kentucky Center for the Arts with some of the performers from the book. And it was filmed, and it was shown on public TV here a few weeks ago. Kentucky to the World filmed that. And so that's now a document and I ended up doing PowerPoints. I did video segments for that were historical things that were shown in between the acts. So that and yeah, the books won like Independent Publishers Award for best book in the Southeast, and best local history from the Louisville Historical League.
So
So,
you literally encapsulated all of the elements of folkloristics and ethnomusicology, right? But documentation, written texts, public facing programming, and archive, right? Because it being videoed not only allowed people to participate who wasn't physically there, but you archived the work so it can be found 100 years from now. Why besides it being making sure it's not lost, why else do you think this is significant for Black folks specifically?
well, like we got to write our own history, especially in time like now. I always thought of my, like I said, I thought of myself as a music nerd, and that I was just having fun. But now in this time where Black culture seems to be under attack, and Black people, to have our own outlets and be able to have our own control of our own narrative, when they're changing stuff at the Smithsonian. You know? I mean, it's just, yeah, we all know what we could trust.
Right, right. So with that, you brought it so full circle. I don't want to go too far, but I will ask you like a B question. Filson Historical Society and your next project, because I believe they're connected, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I joined the board of the Filson Historical Society, and they started an African American history archive. And so I'm on the collections committee, and so mostly that's like trying to get collections or voting on stuff like that. But my next book I'm working on the history of West Louisville, and I'm collecting a lot of things that I intend to donate to the Filson and the University of Louisville. And I've already done like those original jug band things, materials that I collected. They're already in the collection at U of L. But I would like to help the Filson with their archive, with their African American history archive. So I'm just getting into that project, but it's fun.
It sounds groovy. And you also contribute timely and real heavy pieces for the African American Folklorist platform. And we appreciate you for that, good brother.
Yeah, it's a. You should tell them how you ended up in Kentucky.
That's the hysterical thing is I spoke to you maybe a year or two prior,
Uh-huh.
and that's how I found out the richness of Kentucky Black history. And I was like, wow, this is great. But I never saw myself coming here until the transcending of my mother. I still didn't see myself coming here until someone said WKU has the best folklore public practice program. And this might have been about 2 years after you and I
Yeah.
met and started building. And I ended up, it was amazing. I remember telling my cousin when he said, "What are you going to do next?" I said, "I'm thinking about getting a farm." I said, "But not like I'm going to Kentucky or anything." And we ended up here. Yeah, man, we'll talk. This story is not about me. We can talk about that another time. This is about you, brother. But I will tell the people that you're currently working on curating a issue about festivals, right? Black festivals for the special issue for the magazine, right?
Yeah, I went to that Biscuit and Banjos Festival in Durham, and it was so inspiring. And it's one of the things inspired us to bring back the Jubilee next year. it's something we're working on. And so I just thought was one of the panels I sat in on was different women who were putting on festivals in different places, and they were talking about how they work with one another and things like that. And I thought it would be good to have like some kind of guide, something to connect that community, and the African American Folklorist is like a natural archive for that.
Yeah, well, we appreciate it. We appreciate your work. I have to get an applause button because there's no way I could say that and not press the applause button. But I'm going to get that button soon. But thank you for being for the work you do, sitting down with me today, and for the work you do with the African American Folklorist. Folks, tell the folks where to find you and your work and your multiple books.
Okay. I am on Facebook as Michael L. Jones, so you can find me there. Blue Sky as Blueshound 2000, and my jug band book, Louisville Jug Music, can be found on Amazon. It's most places. My first book, Secondhand Stories, is also on Amazon, and that's does have that first jug band story and some other things about Louisville music. And then the new book, Soulful Sounds of Derbytown, is at butlerbooks.com. So.
There you go. Get it while the getting's good. Good brother. I appreciate you, man.
All right. Good talking to you as always.